Well, one Hunt has not been sacked yet. Another Hunt has sacked himself, leaving his constituents in the middle of a cold winter snap, entirely alone, without parliamentary representation for their many troubles. I'm watching with a sick bag by my side the television coverage of this gilded youth, Tristram Hunt. The clue was in the name, by the way. A Labour MP called Tristram is almost certainly up to no good. We're being told that he's making a sacrifice. He's giving it all up for a high-flying job in the world of the arts. But in fact, he's a rat, jumping off the Labour ship, plunging the Labour Party into a difficult by-election in a difficult constituency where UKIP last time was in second place and whose leader, Paul Nuttall, may well now take to the field. It is a calculated act of treachery, of sabotage. It's an attempt to wreck Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. When Louise Mensch abandoned her Northampton constituents in not altogether different circumstances, she was roundly denounced for having abandoned the people whose vote she sought only a couple of years before. Hunt is suffering no such slings and arrows. Personally, I think he'll be much more comfortable in the Victoria and Albert Museum. Perhaps he can open a new Tony Blair, new Labour wing of the V&A. I see him sitting there, sipping his tea, Earl Grey, of course, for he's a blue blood to the tips of his fingers, out of a china cup made in the Ming dynasty. I'm not going to say any more about him because, as they say in EastEnders, he's not worth it. He's just not worth it. But it's going to be the mother of all by-elections, following presumably on the heels of the Copeland by-election, if not held on the same day. And if Jeremy Corbyn were to hold these two seats, then he's in for some fair weather. But if he were to lose them, the turbulence will become extremely intense indeed. The other Hunt doesn't have the grace to go. Jeremy Hunt, I talk about, who's clinging on to his post amidst a sea of troubles in the National Health Service. It's ending in chaos, like Tory governments in whose hands the NHS, we're always told, is safe. There are people dead on trolleys in corridors. There are maternity units closing their doors, sending expectant mothers to other maternity units themselves under the threat of closure. The doctors are working to stem the tide, and the exhaustion on their faces when you see them on the television ought to be enough to make even a Tory ashamed. But perhaps that is a non sequitur. The truth is, Theresa May has to sack Jeremy Hunt. That's sack Jeremy Hunt, or this crisis may be the death of her, as well as many hundreds, maybe thousands of people suffering in this underfunding crisis. So much in common with many people. But I'm going to take now a very controversial stance. I'm arguing that the NHS is being deliberately starved of cash so that people will conclude that it's a hopeless case and should be left on the trolley in the corridor to die and be replaced with an American-style health insurance system which will kill the principle of a universal healthcare system, publicly funded, publicly owned, and available to all in times of need. And I'll be talking to a specialist on this project, Dr. Bob Gill, producer of a wonderful film which is called The Great NHS Heist, just in a few moments from now. And what about the United States of America? A condition of mass hysteria, not seen since the 1950s, at the height of the McCarthyite witch hunts, looking for Reds, literally looking under your bed at night for a Red with snow on his boots, and a fur hat, and a Muscovite accent. Not since those days have we seen anything like the state of mass hysteria existing in the United States over the imminent presidency of Donald Trump. And why? Because Trump doesn't want war with Russia. In fact, he doesn't want war anywhere. He says he has no appetite for regime change. He'd prefer to concentrate on the many problems in the United States itself. Well, that could cost some people a lot of money. The spy agencies could be slimmed down. The military-industrial complex against which President Eisenhower, a former Republican president, warned us in his valedictory address in 1959, when he warned us of their overweening power. A policy of peace and a lack of wars under a President Trump would be very bad for their business indeed. And then there's the war party inside the Republican Party itself, led by John McCain, the senator, who every time I see him reminds me more of Dr. Strangelove in Stanley Kubrick's wonderful, wonderful film of the same name. I can almost see him holding on to his fake arm, trying to stop it from pressing the nuclear button. McCain will not be happy until mushroom clouds sprout across the international landscape, and he's less likely to get that under a president from his own party than from the old warhorse Hillary Clinton, whose defeat he has found particularly hard to bear. McCain handed over a dossier to the FBI, who gave it to the CIA, who gave it to the fake news sites, BuzzFeed and CNN, otherwise known as the Clinton News Network. And who wrote that dossier? Well, don't you know, it was a British MI6 agent, and he handed it to a former British ambassador in Moscow, who handed it to Senator John McCain. The footprints of British intelligence in the extraordinary hoax that was perpetrated this week and which overshadowed entirely the first press conference held by the president-elect will not be easily forgotten by the incoming administration in Washington. Perfidious Albion at work again. Now, it was a fake dossier, as was proved within a few hours of coming into the spotlight and being subjected to the most rudimentary forensics. People's names were spelt wrongly, company names were spelt wrongly, dates of meetings and assignations were falsely recorded at times when they could not possibly have taken place. A man called Cohen, Donald Trump's lawyer, was said to have been meeting the inheritors of the mantle of the KGB in a restaurant in Prague on a given date at a given time, except he'd never been in his entire life in Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic or Prague or that restaurant, and luckily enough for him, was actually on videotape at a basketball game in San Francisco with his student son on the very day, at the very hour, he was said in the dossier to be meeting agents in Prague. You'll remember that Mohammed Atta, the lead hijacker in the terrorist atrocity on 9/11, he was meant to have had an assignation in Prague too, with agents of the Iraqi regime of Saddam Hussein. That was a lie too. And this dossier springs from exactly the same cesspit of immoral, fervid, putrid world of the spies and the spooks posing as ambassadors and other diplomats. Of course, it was guaranteed that the dossier would set everyone on edge, raise an eyebrow or two. After all, it was a dossier that contained an allegation about dancing girls wetting themselves with delight at being in the company of Donald Trump in a hotel room in Moscow, except it was all a lie. Now, it was a lie for one of two purposes, and we'll discuss this later with John Le Boutillier. Even at this late hour, will there be an attempt made to stop Trump taking the oath of office? Certainly the Trotskyite Labourite Paul Mason on Question Time last night actually called for a coup in Washington, that Obama and the CIA and the FBI should step in and forbid, preclude, halt the inauguration of President Donald Trump. Imagine. This erstwhile Marxist-Leninist Mason said there must be something in this because it's raw intelligence. As a journalist, he said, in my job, I'm used to seeing raw intelligence. And he called for a coup. It doesn't seem to have occupied him that a coup at this stage would mean civil war in the United States of America. I mean real civil war. I mean Ukraine-style civil war. But more likely, the purpose is to put Trump in a corner, to blackmail him, as the Russians didn't do, but they are clearly seeking to do, to blackmail Trump into abandoning his flagship policy of peace, not war, with Russia. And then there's Jeremy Corbyn. He relaunched his Labour leadership this week. It didn't go well, for a variety of reasons that I shall explore with a very active and fine young man, Aaron Bastani, political commentator, later in the show. So it's all coming up. Trump, USA, the Corbyn relaunch, the National Health Service crisis, Jeremy Hunt. I'm choosing my words very carefully here. Tristram Hunt. It's all coming up in the course of the next 3 hours. Now, Dr. Bob Gill is, as the name suggests, a medical practitioner of note, but he's also the most indefatigable campaigner to save the National Health Service that was the jewel in our crown, but is being deliberately tarnished by the Tories in order to abolish it. At least that's my point of view. Let's hear if it's his. Dr. Bob Gill, welcome to the show.
Hello, George. Thank you for having me on.
What do you say to my thesis that this is all deliberate? They want people to conclude that the state of hopelessness in the NHS is so great that we can no longer continue with it in its present form.
Well, it's exactly spot on. This stage of the NHS privatisation requires the NHS to fail. It's very hard to convince the public to abandon a system which has worked very well for 60 plus years and switch to an American-style insurance system when it's working well. So the government, over years of defunding, understaffing, cutting of beds, have led up to a situation where people are not getting the treatment or the assessment they need. And I see this on a daily, if not weekly basis in my surgery, where my patients are just not getting admitted when they're sick. They bounce back, they end up back home, and I attempt to send them back in again. So your thesis is spot on.
The crisis is because of the £4.5 billion cut to social care, isn't it?
Yeah.
The social care cuts mean that people who were being looked after at home and outside of hospitals have nowhere to go but the hospitals. And that's what's made a situation that was bad in any case into an emergency.
That is a significant factor. You've also got 600 plus GP surgeries have shut since 2010. We've lost 7,000 hospital beds in that time. We're having a hemorrhaging of staff. Experienced staff have basically had enough. They knew what the NHS was like and could be like, and they're not prepared to put up with the current regime, and they've walked. So you've got a staffing crisis, you've got a bed crisis, and you've got a social services crisis, all cleverly designed to explode. But what the government haven't managed to do is to control all the messaging. And to his credit, Mike Adamson of the British Red Cross last weekend described what the staff know from their own experience. This is a humanitarian crisis, but it's been a crisis that's been building over the last 2 or 3 years. And unfortunately, the bad headlines that the government want to see, they want to see bad headlines, but they want to control the conclusion that people will come to. And the narrative is, we're blaming it on an elderly population. We're blaming it on immigrants. So they've set up the scapegoats, and with this narrative, they will break down the trust in the NHS, the faith in the NHS, and also break down social cohesion and solidarity. And this is the game they're playing.
The news, for it is news to me, that we've got 7,000 fewer beds for a larger population, and by definition an ageing population, will come as a great shock to many people. And when the Red Cross described this as a humanitarian emergency, and when the Red Cross said that they were coming to the rescue of the British National Health Service, the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world, an organisation that normally comes to the assistance of people in disaster zones, why wasn't that turned into a bigger indictment against the government? Why are people not seeing as clearly as they need to why this is being done and who's doing it?
Because we've been subjected to a very clever and long-term propaganda softening up, because most people's conclusion will be, it's just a time of year, or, people are getting older. This is a narrative. We've been primed to believe the narrative. I saw a report on the BBC this week talking about the crisis. They gave no analysis of the bed reduction and simply blamed it on an older population and bed blocking. This is what we've been set up to believe. Blame the patient, blame the staff, blame the system. But the figures are worse. Compared to other countries in Europe, we have half the number of beds per head of population compared to Germany and France. Since the 1980s, we've lost 50% of our hospital beds, and we've lost the hospitals themselves. So, we've been softened up and very gradually brought to this situation. But we're also seeing this fake blame game between Simon Stevens, who is the head of the NHS England, and Jeremy Hunt and the government. But actually, they're completely aligned. Simon Stevens, formerly of United Health, one of the biggest American private insurers, he spent 10 years at United Health, and he's taking us into the phase of the American insurance conversion.
So he's actually an accomplice of Jeremy Hunt.
He's running the show. Since the 2012 Health and Social Care Act, the Secretary of State can only issue a mandate, an instruction, once a year. He has no day-to-day control over the NHS. That has been handed over to the head of NHS England, which is Simon Stevens. So the arguments calling Hunt must go, we're directing the attention at the wrong target. The target needs to be Simon Stevens, Mr. Insurance Man, Mr. United Health, who I have no doubt might be going through the revolving door back to United Health once the job's done in England.
Now, remind me, who's the Labour NHS spokesperson now, and what are they saying about it?
Now, the name escapes me. Formerly it was Heidi Alexander, but the narrative coming from the Shadow Health team is slightly better, but they're not painting the picture that I've just painted. And you've got to ask yourself, why not? This would be a vote winner. If Labour put their hands up and said we spent 13 years teeing up the current situation, we carried on Thatcher's plan for the privatisation, we've made a huge mistake, we regret it, and now we're warning you that this is where it's going. And Labour need to do this.
One of the Blairite MPs, I forget her name too, she said that Labour should stop seeking to exploit the crisis in the NHS.
Exploit wouldn't be the word I would use. I would say warn and raise awareness. But if they're only using it to bash the government, but the end game is the same, well, that's to be condemned. If they're genuinely interested in preserving the best thing about this country, the best functioning health system in the world, it could be most efficient, then they need to come clean and confess their sins over the NHS and say we're going to detoxify the NHS, remove the market, and spend as much money of the NHS budget on patient care. We don't need a tax rise. We just need to stop the hemorrhage, which is going to private finance initiative, which is being spent on all the management consultants and all the marketisation, which is taking nearly a third of the NHS budget is being spent on preparing for the privatisation.
Now, finally, how do people see your wonderful film, The Great NHS Heist?
Right, so The Great NHS Heist is in production. We've been over to the United States. We're crowdfunding it on GoFundMe. And we're sort of halfway through the filming stage, and we're hoping to get it out in the next couple of months. It'll probably be on YouTube. We haven't quite finalised how we're going to get it out. But certainly we need all the help we can get to explain and provide the evidence for this complex deception, which in my book is the greatest betrayal of the public interest.
Dr. Bob Gill, thank you very much indeed. Balder the Brave says the NHS makes Great Britain great, yet the Tories hate it. It's a Tory dream to dismantle the NHS. And then he appends a swear word that I couldn't possibly say in case there are old ladies or children listening. Manpreet Sambi says the jewel in our crown is not even ours anyway. It's stolen. And Rhiannon Aryan says the BBC and the mainstream media wouldn't report the truth on the NHS crisis if it bit it on the bum. A deliberate destruction of the NHS. And Russell sends an SMS. Tristram Hunt. I've got to pick my way through these names so carefully. Tristram Hunt. Is he related to that other Hunt, Jeremy? I could comment further, but if I was Corbyn, I would have sacked all these Blairite backstabbers. However, that's two down, including that other milksop, Jay Reid, who he. But the BBC keeps dredging up these putrid corpses from the Blair era. Perhaps they can put them in the Victoria and Albert in future. Let's talk with Declan in Liverpool on the NHS and the unions. Declan, welcome to the show.
Good evening, George. It's a pleasure to speak to you. I've just been listening to you. Oh, thank you. Just been listening to you and the doctor talking there. The doctor's absolutely right. I remember years ago, going back a little bit, if I can just rewind a little bit, Ron Todd, who was leader of the Transport and General Workers Union. He
was my friend.
Very good. I know that he talked to you very fondly. I know his son, Peter, who's in the music industry. I'm a musician. But anyway... the PFI thing with the NHS, which Blair and Gordon Brown propagated, and I mean, look what's happened. The NHS is in crisis, and even some doctors, even, may I mention, Dr. Rachel Clark, Dr. Oxford, as she's known on Twitter, she was actually support after all her indefatigable and vociferous rantings against Jeremy Hunt, always with grace, though, always with grace, and chasing Jeremy Hunt for answers. She was in favour of Simon Stevens, but I think it's a sham. Simon Stevens, as the doctor said before, was one of the co-authors of the NHS 2000 and the 5-year plan, and he is... part of the dismantling and future privatisation of the NHS, and it's absolutely disgusting. And we are seeing now, I mean, thank goodness for the Red Cross coming out and saying this is a humanitarian crisis. Last night on the BBC Question Time, Gazelle, she was
Gisela
saying...
Stewart.
That's right. That's it. She said, "Well, I wouldn't use the term humanitarian crisis. I think that's a bit excessive." No, it is a humanitarian crisis. I was on the picket lines with the junior doctors in the strike. I gleaned so much information from the horse's mouth, as it were. The junior doctors were telling me how it actually is in Liverpool, and also their friends and colleagues across the country. The NHS is in a despicable crisis, and it's this Tory government that will not listen, and they shy away, and they run. I mean, look at Jeremy Hunt the other day when Beth Rigby from Sky News. I don't really follow Sky News because I don't like Rupert Murdoch, and God bless Dennis Potter for calling his pancreatic cancer Rupert. Dennis Potter, the playwright, and he couldn't abide any journalists working for The Sun, etc. But anyway, back to the point. The NHS is in an absolute crisis. It's on its knees, and bless all the workers from the highest doctors and surgeons right down to the cleaners. Everybody who works for the NHS, they're under so much pressure, and bless them for struggling. So it's just so unfair. And of course, the patients who are suffering, and some of them are dying, and this is totally unnecessary.
If that's not a humanitarian crisis, I don't know what is. People
Absolutely,
dying on
George.
trolleys in corridors. People being locked out of accident and emergency. Doors locked, no more. Customers. People being unable to get the attention of a doctor, sometimes for days. It is people being sent home. People dying when they could have been saved. If that's not a humanitarian crisis, what is a humanitarian crisis?
It's absolutely unbelievable. It's like a sick nightmare, but it's actually the reality. George, I just commend you. I watch you on Sputnik as well with your wife, and it's just so wonderful, all the work that you're doing.
Thanks, Declan.
I'll let you carry on, but this is the people, the public. There are a lot of people on the side of on NHS, but there's an awful lot of people. I read Twitter accounts, and they're in favour of privatisation. They don't realise, or they just can't get it through.
Well, I'll tell you where it ends, Declan. It ends when you fall down in the street in New York City, and the ambulance personnel have to feel for your wallet before they feel for your pulse. Thanks for the call, Declan. You're a gentleman. And thanks for reminding me of the late and great Ron Todd, my old union leader. Now, Baldart says Sadiq Khan has lost the plot. He says Tristram Hunt was a great MP. Lol, what has he done to be a great? Do me a favour, Sadiq. Tristram Hunt was a square-jawed, big palooka, a blue-blooded fake. He was masquerading as a Labour MP in the great city of Stoke-on-Trent. Guy in Stoke-on-Trent will be up in a minute, but first, it's the legend that is Damien in Brighton on the NHS. Go ahead, Damien.
Good evening, George.
Hi.
I'd like to get straight to the point, if I may. I would argue that the Conservative Party is simply incapable of running public services. And the reason that they're incapable of running public services is that they simply don't believe in the principle of services paid by all for the benefit of all. Now, when it comes to the NHS, I think people should think about the consequences of that, because what it means is that by intentionally, the Conservative policy, which doesn't believe in public services, by intentionally underfunding the NHS, the Conservative Party is literally killing people.
Yes, they are. I mean, if you deliberately, as an act of policy, willfully starve the NHS of funds that you were ready to find for bankers, at the drop of a hat in the hundreds of billions, then you are responsible for killing people.
And it's a conscious choice, George.
Yes.
The Conservative ideology is literally killing people. Theresa May would prefer, and does, give tax cuts to corporations than to adequately fund the NHS. Now, I think when people are standing in the ballot booth, George, and they're ready to cast their vote, they should remember and take very seriously the warning that if they do vote Conservative, they'll be putting their family in danger. Because...
Yeah, but what if they vote Labour for a Blairite who's up to the same thing?
Well, I mean, we've obviously got issues within the Labour Party because we do have members who are on the right wing of the Labour Party who share exactly the same views. Those who voted in favour of PFI, those who think that public services should be privatised. So there is an issue in the Labour Party. However, the Labour Party, and it's a point I made before, George, because we have a membership of 630,000 and we have the funding coming through working people in the unions, we are self-funding, so we are able to avoid corruption by corporate interests. So there is hope for us. There is no question, George, that the NHS is safer in the hands of the Labour Party and the Conservatives. And, for example, in Copeland, the voters in Copeland have the guarantee of the Labour Party that, unlike the Conservatives, who are going to pack off pregnant women to a maternity ward 40 miles away, the Labour Party will not only guarantee the maternity, the existence of the maternity ward in the constituency, but they will upgrade that maternity ward. So it's quite a clear choice, George. And I think that people should be aware that if they do vote Conservative, their father, their mother, their sister, their child could well be on the Tory party's list of victims, and that they would have taken part in effectively signing their death warrants by pasting an X next to the name of the Conservative candidate.
Powerful stuff. Damien in Brighton, an SMS from Colin says Theresa May used the well-worn Tory fallback this week. We can only have a strong NHS by having a strong economy. Well, clearly we don't have either. And Rotten Borough says if Russia isn't the bogeyman, it becomes a much harder sell for Trident replacements on both sides of the Atlantic. And Frank Kelly sends an email. George, why is the UK devoid of news on the Israeli embassy official who plotted to take down government MPs unfavourable to Israel and to offer slush funds to MPs? We surely need a full inquiry into Friends of Israel infiltration into our government and its policies. Well, Labour has effectively now called for that inquiry, and I've made a film on it. Get it on my Facebook or through my Twitter. Called The Israel Scandal, and this arises out of the Al Jazeera expose, which is 3/4 of the way through now and is startling to say the least. But thanks, Frank, for mentioning it. Let's talk to Guy in Stoke-on-Trent. Guy, Stoke's going to be a busy and interesting place, even more than usually, in the next couple of months.
George, we've had such an unusual, interesting, unpredictable week. It makes you wonder what's going to happen next. Are they going to discover Elvis and put him up for a candidate? But I just want to say, Tristan, he doesn't need my best wishes because he's going to do well down there. The director who replaces earned almost £5,000 a week. So he'll be able to pay the rent and have enough money for a bag of potatoes. Unlike the assistant the V&A are now looking for to pay the princely salary of £8 an hour. But anyway, Tristan, I don't think he was in the right job. If you look at his background, his father was made a peer by Tony Blair. He was parachuted into Stoke-on-Trent because of Mandelson. And I don't think he ever resonated with the problems, the deprivation, the issues that this city is struggling with. I felt that he was a jolly nice bloke in a wrong job.
Well, he said that the Labour needed to be a party of aspiration. and he defined aspiration as John Lewis couples and people who want to be able to shop at Waitrose. Unfortunately, Stoke doesn't have a John Lewis or a Waitrose. In fact, Waitrose said that they would not open a store in Stoke because it wasn't upmarket enough. How's that for political suicide?
George, and for the Labour Party, I think it's positive in that he was one of the traitors or one of the pact, one of the key figures in trying to get Corbyn destabled or even removed. So if he's gone, I think good riddance to him. I don't wish him any harm. I'm sure he's going to have an excellent career, but I hope that the next guy or the next lady that we get here is a Corbynista, because that's what we need.
Well, it's not just Corbynista, it's the issue of the European Union. 70%, 69.8% of the voters in Stoke voted for Brexit. Labour's stand on Brexit and on the issue of free movement of labour is as clear as mud. If Labour puts up a candidate who is as clear as mud on that overarching, overwhelming issue, then they will lose. Frankly, the way I look at it now, unless the Labour Party put me up in Stoke-on-Trent as the Labour candidate, they're going to lose the seat. And then you will have a bad word to say about the big palooka, because he will have deliberately jumped ship for a £5,000 a week job at a museum in London, leaving his constituents and his party in the lurch.
George, I can only hope and pray that we get someone who's articulate, motivated, can string an argument, can listen to what people are saying, and can win the day. Otherwise, yeah, I would not disagree. But let's give it a chance. Let's give it a go.
Okay, Guy in Stoke-on-Trent. We are talking in the second hour to Aaron Bastani, political commentator, sympathetic to Jeremy Corbyn, and I'm going to be putting many of these points to him. Some very bad by-elections last night in the country, one in Sunderland and one in Three Rivers in Gade Valley, and we'll talk to Aaron about them. Jeremy Corbyn has a real problem. His entire life was spent sitting next to me, so I know what I'm talking about, as an opponent of the EU. They talk now about the single market. Jeremy Corbyn and me and others were the people who stayed up night after night, all through the night, trying to wreck the Maastricht Treaty, which established the single market. Jeremy Corbyn was an absolute opponent of the single market. Neither would the real Jeremy Corbyn have any truck with the idea that in a capitalist society it's some kind of principle that we should allow as many workers to join the queue for a declining number of jobs at a declining rate of wages and conditions, and call it free movement, call it some kind of ideal, call it some kind of principle. But he is paralysed by the existence of a gigantic fifth column inside his party, which sabotaged his relaunch earlier this week. They could not wait to get into the lists with their allies in the so-called mainstream media to rubbish and ridicule their own leader. And now, one after the other, they're jumping ship and creating by-elections in the hope that Labour will lose them and force Corbyn out of the leadership. And you heard from Damien, a well-meaning man in Brighton, saying, it's Labour or bust. But I tell you candidly, I would not, could not vote for a Labour MP who had betrayed Corbyn, who was defying the will of the British electorate, even if they were pretending not to, on the issue of Brexit. I could not, would not vote for a Labour MP who's tied to Tony Blair's money I would not vote, could not vote for a Labour MP that was dripping in the blood of war after war. And on that subject, Hilary Benn, I hear there's a vacancy at the Imperial War Museum. Maybe you should jump ship and take that. Robert Drage says democracy is dying thanks to the military-industrial complex and capitalism. And Trotsky says Tristram Hunt is owed nothing, leaves with nothing, but feels Labour should mourn his passing, conceited to the last. And Geoffrey Mansfield says Blairite Labour will soon follow Tristram into a museum where it belongs. I'm just not so sure about that, Geoffrey, as you are. A backbench opposition Labour MP who has ratted on his constituency, his constituents and his party by ditching them for a £5,000 a week job for spending a night in a museum is currently being treated on the television as, well, Winston Churchill or something like that. A big palooka who's achieved nothing in his entire puff is being puffed as a great loss to the Labour movement. You couldn't make it up. Now, Aaron Bastani is a coming man, a likely lad. He's a political commentator. I see his stuff all over the place. And I thought it was best if we talked to him about the situation in the Labour Party. Not just now, the relaunch of Jeremy Corbyn's leadership that was widely trailed this week didn't take off in the way that he, or for that matter, I, would have liked. And now, another by-election. Aaron Bastani, welcome to the show.
How are you doing, George?
Let's start, Aaron, with the breaking news that one of the great towering figures of Labour politics in Britain, somebody called Tristram Hunt, who was parachuted into Stoke-on-Trent, a place with which he had little affinity and still less understanding. He's ditched it for a top job in the Victoria and Albert. Are you crying into your iron brew this evening about that?
No, I'm not. It's a plum job for a plum. So they're made for each other. For me, being an MP, it's probably the highest calling. It's the highest level of public service in Britain. It's a privilege. It should be considered by the placeholder as an honour. And he doesn't obviously think that. Just the way in which he's departed, 3 years out from a general election, I just think it really tells you a lot about the man and his politics, which is not very much.
He was captured on tape in the Cambridge Union. In fact, he was there the same week I was last year, telling the gilded youth of the Cambridge Union that they had to step forward because they were the elite, they were the 1%, and they had to take control of the Labour Party and the British political system. This is exactly the kind of elitism that has placed constituencies like Stoke-on-Trent now on rather a dangerous wicket.
Absolutely. I had the pleasure of being on Sky earlier talking with Dan Hodges. And, there are some people on the right of the Labour Party who I disagree with them. I know you disagree with them. But they are strong people. They're quite resilient people. They're tough. And the likes of Jamie Reid, the likes of Tristram Hunt do not fall into that category. They don't really care about their politics to the extent that they're not willing to stay in the organisation to change it, to make it reflect their values. John McDonnell has done that since the early 1990s. Jeremy Corbyn has done that since 1983. If you want to change things for the better, that's often what you have to do. You have to stick with it. And people like Jamie Reid, people like Tristram Hunt, who've had a pretty easy life. They just got on that escalator to what they thought would be Blairite success and later being in government. Hasn't worked out for them. And then they've just chosen to leave it like a baby's rattle.
Now, you mentioned Jay Reid, and you were talking about Tristram Hunt. That's two by-elections. We can talk about them because they haven't been called yet. Both of them are strongly Brexiteer constituencies. Both of them are poor working class constituencies. Labour better look lively in choosing their candidate and no more parachuting in of blue bloods. What do you say?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's a funny fact that it was actually the chair of the constituency Labour Party in Stoke ran against Tristram Hunt as an independent in 2015, which is sad because he now probably won't be able to rejoin the party. I'm sure he was a great chair. In Stoke, I think it's a majority of 5,000, so Labour should win that pretty well. During the summer, during the leadership bid, Corbyn did an event there, really well attended, 1,000, 1,500 people there. And all those people, whether or not they're members of the Labour Party, if they can be mobilised to get onto phone banks, to deliver leaflets, to have conversations on streets and in workplaces and in schools and in FE colleges, then I think that majority could actually be enhanced quite significantly. So we should be looking at, I think, a majority of over 5,000. Copeland is a bit more difficult because it's next to a Tory seat. The majority has been going down every election for a while. And, of course, Sellafield is a big issue. And Corbyn is a known critic, sceptic of nuclear power. So a bit more difficult there for Labour. But I think if Corbyn and Corbyn's Labour win both of them, that really needs to put to bed the idea that this guy won't be there for the next general election. I don't think it will, because we're dealing with absolute clowns and imposters, but it should do.
Well, let's look at the by-elections last night. Sandhill in Sunderland, one of the first to declare for Brexit, another poor working-class place. The Lib Dems achieved a staggering 36% swing from Labour to them. The Liberal Democrats got 45% of the vote. That is up 41.5%. Labour got 25%, that is down 29.9%. UKIP also down 7.2% and came in at 18.7%. The Conservatives on 10% and the Greens on 1.3%. And in Gade Valley, Three Rivers, the Lib Dems gained a seat from the Conservatives. The Lib Dem vote was 60.9%, that's up 24%. The Conservatives on 19%, that's down 22%. Labour on 11%, that's down 9.6%. And UKIP on 6.7%, they didn't stand the time before, and coming in at 6.7%. There are a number of things we can draw from that, but one of them is that the Lib Dems are back in town.
Well, yes and no. I mean, they do very well in by-elections anyway. These weren't parliamentary by-elections. They were for, I think, parish councils was the one in the northeast. What we can say is that, yes, the Lib Dems are going to challenge in Tory seats that voted Remain, places like Witney, places like Richmond. We've seen that at the big level. Obviously, they won Zach Goldsmith's former seat in Richmond. What really impressed me with the result, like the first one you highlighted in Sunderland, was the UKIP finish. And you've got two parties of the centre and the centre-left, and the radical left now, obviously, with Labour. And between them, they got something like 65% of the vote, in a place that, like you say, was a very strong Leave part of the country. And that's counterintuitive to the media message which we're hearing, which is the new cleavage in British politics is Leave and Remain. That's just not true. That's something of an issue, absolutely. But I think the main cleavage in British politics now is status quo or change. Declining living standards like we've had for 10 years, wages down over 10% since 2007, or trying something different. And the big battle now is to say, well, yeah, we do want to try something different, but it's not necessarily about blaming immigrants. It's not about attacking people from minorities or being prejudiced to people from the LGBT community or women. It's about having a different kind of economic model. It's about providing opportunity for all people. It's about saying we can have an economy built on abundance, not scarcity and race.
So if Paul Nuttall, the new leader of UKIP, runs as seems to me likely in Stoke-on-Trent, you're confident, are you, that Labour will increase its majority?
I think so. Look, what we've got to get with UKIP and Nigel Farage is the history of the two in the last 10 years is inextricable. And like him or loathe him, and I don't like him very much, Nigel Farage is probably the most historically significant conservative politician for sure, of his generation. Very, very, very effective operator. And I don't think Paul Nuttall is anywhere near to fill his boots. Paul Nuttall has some bizarre opinions on abortion, on gay rights, on all manner of things. He's Catholic. He reminds me of the kind of Bible-bashing politics you associate with mid-90s Republican America. And I don't know, if that really fits with Britain, because you can make lots of claims about, it's all up in the air. Politics is being reconstituted in a way we haven't seen for decades. All true. But Britain's a secular country. In a way, that actually drives, I think, some of the Islamophobia, because that's kind of tied up with what we think are liberal mores of not displaying your religion in public. And I don't think it fits well, his politics. He talks of himself as a libertarian, yet he thinks that his Catholic politics should stop women having abortions after 24 weeks, but also that women shouldn't wear the burqa. So he believes in religious freedom for himself, but not for Muslims. I think the inconsistencies of the man will be found out, and I don't think he's as savvy and as smart as his predecessor.
Well, we'll see if you're right about that. Let's turn to the relaunch. It didn't go well. It was trailed as Jeremy Corbyn going to indicate, as he did, that Labour was not wedded to so-called free movement of labour as a principle. And that was supposed to be the day's story, a departure from a previous position evinced by Jeremy Corbyn, and an attempt to move in the direction of the people who voted for Brexit. Most Labour MPs, constituencies, voted in many cases very heavily for Brexit. It was supposed to be a gesture, a genuflection, if as a person of Catholic background myself, you'll permit me that word, in their direction. But it was quickly overshadowed by two things. First of all, the caveat entered unexpectedly, unscripted, that whilst not wedded as a principle to freedom of movement of labour, we don't rule it out. And the second was, out of nowhere, again unscripted, a changing of the subject to the issue of salary caps, which would have, of course, required the departure of the entire first team and most of the reserve team of Arsenal Football Club for foreign climes, because no salary cap, worth calling a salary cap, could possibly have allowed them to earn the money they're currently earning. Why can't Jeremy Corbyn stick to a message?
Why can't he stick to a message? Well, I think in regards to freedom of movement, the stuff that was reported in The Guardian the night before he did all these media interviews in regards to freedom of movement, I don't believe he believes it. It's difficult for him to stick to a message when he doesn't personally believe it, and I can sympathise with that. I think whatever you think about the difficulties facing Labour right now, the exact same ones in many ways are facing the Tory party. It's just the media doesn't talk about it. You have a coalition in Labour, a historic coalition between the poor and people who've cared about the poor for over a century. Well, a century, actually, in its current expression, more or less. And that coalition is coming apart to some extent. It's been held together as it is by our electoral system for a very long time, but it really can't hold for that much longer. And this issue of freedom of movement is probably the crucial insertion into that cleavage, which is pulling it apart almost by the week. And he knows full well that freedom of movement is one issue that upsets and angers one half of the coalition, and motivates the other ones to vote for him rather than a Liz Kendall or a Chuck Rumina. So it's a difficult sell for him, particularly around freedom of movement. Fundamentally, I think it's quite easy. You say to the British public, the economy, your jobs, wages depend on access to the single market. If we want access to the single market, then we're going to have freedom of movement. At the same time, we want to repatriate powers around nationalising, renationalising, Royal Mail, railways, and so on. But you have to be clear about that, and I think fundamentally that's what the Tories ultimately are going to choose. I think that's what's going to happen. So freedom of movement, I think, should be defended, but not necessarily from a moralistic point of view. You can make a very hard-headed economic case. It's one of those rare issues where the social justice argument and the economic argument actually align. So I don't know why they're making such a mess of it, but it can get very messy. I mean, freedom of movement, if they don't get it right, really, really could screw up the project. Because the people who are going to go to Copeland, who are going to go to Stoke, these Corbynites, the activists who've won in 2 leadership races, if all of a sudden he backtracks on freedom of movement, they're going to be very pissed off and they won't come out for the guy. And right now they're his biggest resource. So I think that's what they need to be very wary of. If they're talking to the electorate, but not their own people, they sacrifice the one thing they've really got going for them.
Well, you've identified a dichotomy which is potentially fatal. If the Labour activists require Jeremy Corbyn to speak against and act against and pledge himself against the wishes of the majority of Labour voters, that way lies the destruction of the project, to use your phrase. And if he does, he loses the activists. That's the dichotomy you seem to be drawing. But although you're a more fervent supporter of Jeremy these days than I am, I've known him for longer than you. And frankly, the backtrack was in supporting the EU in the first place. I sat beside Jeremy Corbyn, literally, for decades in Parliament, opposing the EU in all its works, including so-called freedom of movement.
George, listen, I was for Brexit until a month before the vote, because for me, it had to be slow. We had to stay in the European Economic Area, not because I think it's a good thing. I agree it's a bad thing, but we needed to land a political blow to European elites, to domestic elites, and to inspire the peoples of Europe, particularly in Greece, particularly in Spain, to change this institution or to dump it. But if we leave the EEA, if we leave the single market, the consequences that will have to the UK economy in the short term, I think will be very significant. And I don't say that because I'm worried about the markets or anything like that. I say that because right now, the far right, is on the up. And a recession of 2 or 3 years, wages going down in the next 10 years like they have for the last 10 years, will only serve to invigorate further a reactionary politics, which actually has no solutions on declining living standards or falling wages. That's why I'm really worried about leaving the single market. I'm as opposed to it as you are. I don't think Afghans drowning in the Med and a wall being built around Bulgaria. You know, we talk about a wall in Mexico and think Donald Trump's so awful. The same thing, guess what's happening on Europe's periphery? I don't think that's freedom of movement either. But if we leave the single market, it's going to have really, really terrible political consequences, I think, for the left. And it's going to be like manna from heaven for UKIP.
Well, let me just remind you of the results yesterday. You say that the far right is on the up, but UKIP lost votes in Sunderland, lost 7.2 and gained only 6.7 in the other by-election. And you yourself said that the centre-left parties got almost 2/3 of the vote. So to characterise Britain as being in a state of pivot towards the far right simply isn't true, Aaron.
But do you not think that, George, okay, so UKIP in the last election got 4 million votes. If we get this wrong, let's say we have 20, 30 Labour MPs now resign. Let's say we have a general election in a year and Article 50 still hasn't been triggered for whatever reason, and there's a lack of confidence in both Labour and the Conservative Party. Do you not think, if we get this wrong, that UKIP could get 6, 7 million votes? Because I think they could. I don't think it's likely, but it's my worst-case scenario, and it's perfectly plausible.
I think they will get millions of votes if Labour cannot discover clarity on the issue. And right at this moment, as you yourself said, as a prominent Corbyn supporter, the dichotomy of what the voters want and what the members and activists want is potentially fatal to the project. You've been a gentleman, Aaron. Thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows this evening. Simon Brian Anderson said, That intro had my heart pounding and my hair stood on end. We're warmed up now, he says. Woo! Thanks, Simon. I appreciate that. Now, Aaron Bastani and I fairly substantially, in a polite way, disagreed in the course of that interview, but I must hand him the accolade of the best quote of the night. So good, Aaron, that I wish I'd said that. I will, I promise you. Tristram Hunt has landed a plum job for a plum. Brilliant, son. Here's Robert in London responding to Aaron. Go ahead, Robert. Hello, Robert. Yes, Robert, you're on the air. Oh, my goodness, I hear a door creaking. I hear footsteps. Hello, Robert. This is sounding like the Blair Rich Project. Go ahead, Robert. Let's see what's going on. I hope someone didn't come to any harm. Marie McFarlane, one of my favourites, says, instead, the Scottish NHS is also in crisis. Shame on the Scottish government. We also have alerts and dying patients. This is a reference to the fact that it's not just the Tories that are presiding over a health service. The SNP in Scotland for almost a decade have been presiding over a national health service that is in total crisis. Now, they want to blame Westminster, but they have the power to raise taxes on the richest people in Scotland, in fact on anybody in Scotland, to pay for a health service, but they absolutely refuse to use it. So Marie's quite right to point out that the SNP, old bedfellows, of course, with the Tories, are also responsible for dying patients. We finally got Robert back. He's back at the phone. Robert, hi.
Hello, George.
Some wonderful sound effects of your creaking door there. You need to get some oil and pour it on the joints. Go ahead.
That's fine. Just two quick points. One is, so I would consider myself to have sort of, on foreign affairs, I probably agree with you, but on more domestic matters, that would put me on the right of the party notionally. So that's the context in which about what I'm about to say. People like Tristram Hunt, people like Jamie Reid, these people are not Labour people. I think it's despicable that people come into politics, probably manoeuvred their way through getting selected for becoming an MP when there was good local candidates they could have used, and the moment things go a bit iffy, they just leave because things aren't their way, because their side of the party wasn't in charge. At least in the old days, for example, Harold Wilson, after he stopped being Prime Minister, he stayed as an MP for ages. John Major, to his credit, stayed as MP for a while. Gordon Brown stayed as MP for a while. I know you don't like these two, but Roy Hatterley and Neil Kinnock didn't just leave after things didn't go their way. They stayed and fought. These people, to be honest, they're very typical of the sort of Blairite MPs that you have. I think of Alan Milburn. I can think of, there's another fellow who ended up at the BBC. Is it James Purnell?
Yep.
These people,
the one thing, these people have a lot of things in common, Robert, but one of them is that they all abandoned Labour, abandoned their constituencies for very large sums of money.
Exactly.
It's not that they left Parliament and became impecunious. They left Parliament and became vastly richer than they were in Parliament. And I have no particular problem with Tristram Hunt. In matter of fact, he wrote a rather good biography of Engels. And as an individual man, he's quite convivial in a kind of upper-class bluff, palooka sort of a way. But to portray himself as somehow being a victim in this, that somehow he's been done down and is being forced to leave Parliament, so bad has it all become, is just utterly preposterous. He's going on to do a job looking after Ming vases for £5,000 a week.
It's a fiasco. This is actually a fiasco. And although in his defence, he's always craved that job in terms of his historical background. So though I have a lot of ire for him, I share more ire for particularly the Jamie Reid case, because this one was very very conniving, very
he tripled his wages going to work for British Nuclear Fuels.
you couldn't make it. You people like that, you couldn't make it up. I'm trying to think. I think there's a few more from that particular strand who've been like that.
Yeah, there is. Look, I really appreciate the point that you're making, especially as we have different politics, at least on domestic issues. But what did you think? I'd be interested, though you've got a London voice, a Northern voice might be a different one. But what Aaron said was potentially fatal for me.
It is. Look,
he said that the members, the activists, won't wear a coming to terms with the meaning of the British decision to leave the European Union, and that the voters seem to want that coming to terms. And that leaves Corbyn in simply an impossible place.
It's a fiasco. This is a fiasco. I was going to say there's people sort of... It's a weird coming together where we could be pretty much caught on a very dangerous splinter cell. So from the right, you'd have UKIP, and theoretically from the left, you'd have the Greens and the Lib Dems. And that would result in a situation where Labour's pretty much impotent. The irony is, if Corbyn stuck to his...
Are you there? What a pity.
Yeah.
I was really enjoying that. Can we get Robert back? It would be good to finish that. Robert, you there, son?
Yes, I can hear that.
Yeah, you were saying the irony is if Corbyn had stuck to his principles.
If he'd stuck to his principles beforehand, and if he'd said before the election, and it would have looked good, by the way, because the optics would have been he's held captive by his party, and he said, no, we must leave, he would have had more of a purchase over what we're talking about now. So,
well, Robert, you've just said something that I feel in my deepest tissues of my heart. If Corbyn, and it was possible to do so, Corbyn could have said, as Mr. Wilson did, he was a friend of mine, by the way. I used to visit him at his home long after he was Prime Minister, just behind Westminster Cathedral. Mr. Wilson said in 1975, it's a free vote. You can campaign for whatever you like. And Mr. Corbyn could have said, it's a free vote, and I'm going to campaign, like Mr. Benn, like Mr. Skinner, as I've done all my life, for Britain to leave the European Union.
And he would have been able to dictate what we're talking about now.
Exactly.
Very easily.
If he had done that, and then Brexit won, Labour would have been positioned to sweep up the electoral gains across the country.
It's the irony that he allowed himself to be. It's a travesty, really. But it's the irony that he allowed himself to be boxed in by people who then tried to turn him the day after the referendum.
Yeah, they tried to blame him for losing
after defending a position that he disagreed. That he clearly must have disagreed with. Boxed in to do it. Afterwards, they turned on him and said, "Oh, you could have defended us more," as if that was ever plausible. And it's a shame that he didn't foresee that beforehand. And now we're in a situation whereby I don't want to say it's dead, but Labour has to look at the last rights about it. Sadly.
Robert, all these Catholic references are making me nostalgic. Thank you very much indeed, Robert, for a fantastic call, despite the technical difficulties and the creaking door jamb. Wayne Mack says, is Campbell Claret prepping the media for another Tony Blair swoop on democracy? Seems like it, George. I don't know, is this new? Tell me, give me further and better particulars on that. Stephen Ralph says, the things Bastani will do for self-promotion. Well, that's not fair because we chased him for this interview. He didn't chase us. John Keith is on the line from Southport in Merseyside. He is the former Merseyside correspondent of the Daily Express. And that's particularly important on the eve of important new developments in the case of the Hillsborough disaster. The inquiry has come and gone. It made findings of fact which were of profound importance and must have surely moved mountains in terms of what happens next. There are bound to be legal consequences from the findings of the inquiry. Now, John was a journalist at the time. He was at another match, but hearing the reports of the disaster in Hillsborough, he headed for the scene of what I would describe as the crime. And he's kindly agreed to join us now as the Hillsborough investigators pass 23 cases to the CPS for possible charges. John, I know it's painful for you to do so, but if you can, would you just recall for the listeners, particularly younger listeners, who did not, as you did and as I did on the television, see all this unfolding in real time in front of our eyes?
Yes, good evening, George. Actually, as you said, I was at the other semi-final, Everton v Norwich in Birmingham, played at Aston Villa. We heard about this awful news trickling through while we were covering that match. In fact, one of the reporter's sons was at Hillsborough, and of course, in the days before laptops and mobile phones, he didn't know whether his son was safe or not. Fortunately, he was. But we made our way back to Merseyside, and the following morning I was at Anfield very early, and it was a scene I will never, ever forget. The stadium outside was covered in floral tributes, and the crowds were massing, and Peter Robinson, the chief executive, took a very brave decision, but the right decision, because he said, open the gates, and the crowd were let in. And from that moment on, for, I would say, the next month, Anfield wasn't a football ground, it was a garden of remembrance. The whole pitch was completely covered in flowers and floral tributes. I spent every day there for about 3 weeks, from 10 in the morning to 10 at night, and the scene of the pitch with the flowers and the sounds of the grieving families as they came in will live with me forever. It was quite awful to hear this awful grief manifesting itself, George.
And John, the only for the efforts, the courage, the staying power of those who campaigned for justice for the 96, we wouldn't be where we are now. And where we are now is that 23 cases have been passed to the CPS for possible charges. In this window, in which we can discuss that, because no charges have yet been laid, tell us what kind of charges these would be and what kind of people they might be against.
Well, apparently there are 23 individuals and organisations. Now, the individuals and the families are not very happy about this, include only 8 former police officers. Now, given the number of police involved in this huge exercise on the day and subsequent allegations of a cover-up, they feel that it is a scant figure. It should be much more than that. Also, Sheffield Wednesday Football Club and Sheffield City Council could also face corporate charges after the inquest, the second inquest, the one that counted last year, concluded that fans had been unlawfully killed following a succession of mistakes and blunders. So that's the sort of thing we're looking at. But of course, the Hillsborough families are used to waiting. They've waited now for 29 years for an end to this, and it could be at least 6 months now before there's a decision on whether, how many and if any charges are going to be brought. So to say they've been patient is the understatement of the century, I think.
That's why I asked the question, John, because how do you get to 23 if only 8 are likely to be police officers who were on duty at the time? 8 to 23 is a big gap. Who else might they charge?
It's the Yorkshire Ambulance Service. Also, possibly a law firm who were involved with the police, Sheffield Wednesday Football Club, Sheffield Council. So when you add several individuals from each of those organisations to 8 former police officers, you get to this total apparently of 23.
Well, the police, it's now clear, weren't just negligent. Not all the police, of course. Weren't just negligent. They then presided over, some of them, allegedly, the cover-up that you referred to. They changed people's statements. They added things to people's statements to give an entirely false impression of who was responsible for this slaughter. Don't think that's too strong a word. 96 people go to a football game and never come back. It strikes at the very heart of people's confidence in policing, don't you think?
Well, that's a very good point you raised, George, because the Independent Police Complaints Commission, which has been investigating the alleged conspiracy, they said it had identified 289 police accounts which had been amended. Now, that doesn't seem to square to the
eight charges.
Any normal individual with only 8 former officers facing potential charges, I would suggest.
Well, I agree with that, and that's the conundrum. That's why I wanted to talk to you about it tonight. That's the conundrum. How long will we have to wait before we know the CPS decision on these 23 possible charges, John?
Well, we are told between 3 and 6 months, which would take it up to beyond 29 years since the awful disaster. So that is, and of course, the tragedy on tragedy is that many of the families, the bereaved families, are no longer with us. They, in this long wait for justice, we've lost them. They've gone. So those who are left, I think, are just hoping against hope that they get what they feel is justice at the end of it. But I would suggest that these numbers that we're looking at now might imply that we're not going to get that.
John Keith, you're a gentleman. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Former Merseyside correspondent for the Daily Express, recalling those dreadful, dreadful days after the slaughter, I'm not resiling from that word, of 96 football fans. Coming to you later, Donald. Donald, where's your trousers? We might play if Edward can find it. Donald, where's your trousers? It's a Scottish thing. Alan McHugh, 64, sends me the best tweet of the night so far. If Johnny Cash lived in Glasgow, his famous song would have been A Boy Named Tristram. Very good. Now, speaking of Scotland, John is not only in Scotland, he's not only in a hospital, I think he's sitting on a trolley in a corridor like thousands of others, the length and breadth of the country. John, have I got that right?
Well, sort of, George, but thanks to the staff here, that isn't the case. I've been looked after really well.
Yes, are you able to tell us which hospital you're in?
Well, I'm in, it's called Cross Hill in Kilmarnock.
I know it well. I visited my dying friend, Willie McKelvey, there just a couple of months ago. A very fine staff there, but they're under pressure, like the other hospitals in Scotland and in the rest of Britain. Describe the situation, John.
Well, can I just say, I'm going to read the email I was about to send you. I sent an email to it bounced back to me, so I should read out to you the email?
Yeah, of course, yes.
Right, okay, here it is. The title is this: Without our A&E services, I could be dead today. I've just been put in hospital today after having a mild stroke. If it had not been for wonderful staff, NHS, I was a very, very sick chap today. In no way am I nationalistic, but I feel blessed to be born British. Being born British allows me to get access to the NHS. The treatment I've had today is world class, and you'd never get the same in the private sector. And just to finish off, George.
Well, you're exactly right. In fact, if we go down the American road, they would have felt for your wallet before they felt for your pulse.
Well, listen, I went to the hospital. I went to see a doctor, and then the doctor got me in the ambulance up from. I was down in Girvan, blew ambulance, stripped it up to Kilmarnock, met with the stroke team, had a CT scan. They discovered blood in my brain, right? And they're looking after me really well, and I just can't fault them, mate. And I went from being what I thought was a healthy individual to a very sick person. And thanks to seriously, if it wasn't for the NHS, I'd be in a right state.
Well, John, may God bless you and strengthen you, and God bless all those working in Cross Hills and elsewhere in the NHS.
And one last thing, George.
Evening. Yes.
One last thing. I spoke to you before. I live in New Zealand, and I've come over to see my family.
Okay.
I spoke to you previously, and I came over here, and what can I say? Luckily, this service is outstanding, mate. It's looked after me. Brilliant.
John, the very best of luck. And also, please pass our regards to the people that are looking after you there and who may well have saved your life. That was John on a trolley in Scotland, where the SNP are in power, have been in power for almost 10 years, and where the health service is in crisis, and where hundreds of people have died as a result of this crisis in healthcare on this small island, which just happens to be at least the sixth and maybe the fifth richest economy in the entire world. Let's hear from Lizzie in Gloucestershire on the Aaron Bastani interview and the situation facing Jeremy Corbyn. Lizzie, always welcome. Go ahead, please.
Good evening, George.
Hi,
How are you?
I'm good, thanks.
Oh, good. Well, first of all, can I echo the sentiments of that last gentleman caller and all the medical staff around the country? You know, what a fantastic job they do. And the Tories are privatising the hell out of the NHS, and we must stand up and stop them. I'll stop talking about it there. First of all, it's fantastic to hear Aaron on your show. He talks absolute sense, I would say 99.9% of the time, and I totally agree with everything that he says. JC is the first socialist leader of the Labour Party for a long time.
Yes.
And I won't be distracted by all these political coups that are going on to try and get him ousted. I do believe that many people are not stupid, and they realise what the plan is. The plan is to keep both parties, the Tory party and the Labour Party, and UKIP, of course, and Lib Dems, as conservative as they possibly can, with the top tier of politicians all catapulted into posts that will bring them to the House of Commons, and there they create a strong force to privatise, to keep the rich rich and the poor poor.
Well, you've summed it up brilliantly, Lizzie. I saw many people like Tristram Hunt. If I put it this way, they used to look at the older, frailer members of Parliament as they carried their trays across their canteen, looking for signs that some of them might fall down dead and create a by-election, on the principle well known in politics that where there's death, there's hope. And often, more often than not, over the last 20 years, maybe 25 years now, it was precisely people like them who were working as researchers and even just runners in the House of Commons who would get seats being held by coal miners, steel workers, transport workers, working class leaders, trade union officials and so on, that had held those seats in heartland labour areas for, in some cases, many decades, 3-4 decades even. But when they passed on, by one means or another, retirement or death or ill health, they were invariably succeeded by parachute jumpers like Tristram Hunt, who had no claim whatever to be the Labour candidate in a heartland seat, in a working class area, in a deprived and poor part of the country. They were blue bloods, sons of colonels, sons of members of the House of Lords, and their only qualification in the case of Hunt was that he was a chum of Peter Mandelson. Mandelson fixed it that Hunt would be the Labour candidate. The guy who was the chairman of the Labour Party in Stoke and was the standout, he was the standout candidate, was carved out of the Labour nomination process and had to stand as an independent against Hunt. And now the wages of sin, we see this Hunt, who got the Plum seat, who is himself a Plum, has now gone on to a Plum job, and he will never look backwards at Stoke-on-Trent ever again in his puff. So when are we going to learn the lesson from this?
Well, are we going to learn the lesson, or are we going to still be dictated to by the central capitalist party, which it is capitalist. I know we're all brought up as neoliberals now, aren't we? We're force-fed this diatribe, but I do think that hopefully local people in their CLPs will stand up and realise and fight against this, because, hopefully they can overcome it. But I just wanted to say finally, we were all tweeting yesterday, Hunt must go, about Jeremy Hunt.
And it worked, he's gone. But it's the wrong Hunt.
Well, this is it. Well, I was going to say, when we were tweeting Hunt must go, we really didn't realise that there were two.
Dirty, rotten Hunts. That's what I say. Lizzie in Gloucestershire, fantastic call. Thanks very much for it. Salman Khan says there was a tribute to the NHS during the Olympic opening ceremony. But the Tories are destroying the NHS and people will die. Good point, Salman. John sends an SMS. Pity, the Sun not charged for Hillsborough fake news headlines. Well, you and me both, mate. And Gordon emailed, if one needed any evidence of the bias and impotent nature of British journalists, it's thus. Jeremy Hunt stood in Parliament and in every studio telling the country he was imposing a contract on the junior doctors. His lawyers argued in court that he never was and had no intention of so imposing. And Jan says Blairite Labour will soon follow Tristram into a museum where it belongs. Again, I say, I'm actually not as sure about that as you are. And the same Jan, I think, says, and Tom Watson can go to Madame Tussauds, where all the backstabbers go on show. Jan, there's not enough wax in Madame Tussauds to make a model of Tom Watson. There's not enough room on the stands for a model of Tom Watson. Don't get me started on Tom Watson. Now, coming up in the final hour, we've got the sage, John Le Boutillier, former Republican congressman, now a talk show host, just a week away from Donald Trump as President of the United States. That's if somebody doesn't kill him on the way to the gig. And don't think I'm joking. I've just got a few names for you. Jack Kennedy, Bobby Kennedy, Richard Nixon. It's possible in the US to overthrow leading political figures, and some people seem to me to be desperate to do so in the case of Donald Trump. And if he gets there, it's the corner for him. Talk Radio. I'm joined now by my old friend, former Congressman John Le Boutillier, our sage across the pond. But even he'll have difficulty in explaining the week they've had in Washington, D.C. I've been watching American politics all of my life, and that's, by the grace of God, been a long time. I cried on the street when my father came out to tell me that Jack Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas. I cried in the street when I saw the billboard that Robert Kennedy had been murdered in California. I have followed the trials and tribulations of political leaders, diverse political leaders. I saw the overthrow of Richard Nixon from within the deep state, the deputy head of the FBI, otherwise known as Deep Throat, giving information to journalists to bring down the president, which they succeeded in doing. I saw the skullduggery involved in bringing down Jimmy Carter by the Iranians refusing to release the American embassy hostages and doing a secret deal with Ronald Reagan to provide that October surprise to benefit his presidency. I've seen George W. Bush stealing the presidency on the basis of a rigged vote in the Supreme Court, and I saw the Democratic Party accepting it meekly, even though the consequences, as at least they turned out, were simply catastrophic. But I have never seen anything like the turbulence on the Potomac that I've been watching and listening to in the past week. So I need to turn to my friend, our expert, John Le Boutillier, who's joining us via Skype. John, it's been the mother of all weeks in Washington. Would you begin by summarizing it for us?
Yeah, it's the mother of all weeks, and if this is what a week in the transition is going to be like, what in the hell is the actual administration going to be like starting a week from today? I have no idea.
Well, the first question that arises, is he going to be allowed to take the oath? Or is there going to be some last-minute attempt to stop him doing so?
No, he's going to take the oath a week from now, and we should actually do our show together that day because it's a historic day. At my noon, your 5 p.m., he will become, is that right? My 5? Or is, 5 p.m. He'll be sworn in. He'll be, a week from right now, he'll be president, and it's not going to be changed in the next week. But in the last week, since last Friday, so much stuff has happened, all involving the intelligence community, which briefed him last Friday at 12:30 New York time. And we did not know until Tuesday afternoon that at that Friday briefing, in other words, 4 days later, we found out, he was presented a 2-page synopsis of allegations that had been accumulated from Russia of things that the Russians might have, emphasis on might, on Trump that they could use to blackmail him, including financial stuff and sexual stuff. None of us knew any of this, right? But someone last Tuesday afternoon leaked out the fact that he had been given this at the briefing in Trump Tower last Friday. This was done on Tuesday because Wednesday morning he had his first press conference in 6 months. It was in the lobby of Trump Tower, and it was one of the more bizarre press events you've ever seen. It had been set up originally for him to say that he's divesting himself of his family company, which he said he was doing, but he's not. But it quickly became an attack by Trump and his people on the media over this Russian thing. And some of the media fought back on him. And he's at war with the media going into the presidency. And more importantly, he is at absolute white-hot temper war with the intelligence community, the CIA, the NSA, the FBI, that whole group. He's blaming them for leaking out the fact that this synopsis exists, and he was shown it last Friday. Again this morning, George, at 6 a.m., he was tweeting, blaming them for leaking it out.
Well, I mean, that has the benefit of being true, because it must have been them that leaked it out.
It could have been the White House. I think it could have been the White House still.
Well,
could have been.
Okay. It was the deep state that leaked it out, just like Deep Throat was the deputy director of the FBI.
Mark Felt.
Yeah. But let's walk that back, starting at the end point. The person who handed this dossier, and dossier has a very loaded meaning here, John, because of the fake dossiers that were used to march us into the Iraq War. This dossier was handed to the FBI, by his own admission now, by your friend and mine, not the leader of what I call the War Party in the U.S. Congress, John McCain. He was given that dossier by a former British ambassador to Moscow, a very close friend of Tony Blair. You can't say more damning than that here in Britain. And he was given the dossier by a former British intelligence agent, if the word former means anything in the intelligence world. And thus, from our point of view, if the Russians were interfering in your election, it seems the British were interfering in it too. How much has that impacted on the furore that has erupted?
It hasn't. The English role in this has gotten zero attention.
You can be sure that Trump doesn't think that, though.
No, certainly when he figures out, as you say, the provenance of this thing, that it was handed to McCain, McCain and Trump hate each other. And you and I hate McCain.
Exactly.
I've hated him since 1974. He's a horror show of a human being.
He's Dr. Strangelove, isn't he?
He's an odd duck, and he was an odd duck when he was a young boy by his mother's own admission. His interlude in North Vietnam isn't the reason he's so strange, but it has given him a shield politically where you really can't assail him because, he was a hero, he's a POW, you can't talk about him,
Well, so much for the provenance. Let's talk about the contents. Because old ladies might be listening, or even young children, including my own, I won't go into the dirtiest of the details, but sufficient to say, it is said that Trump conducted himself in a morally disreputable manner whilst in Moscow, and that the security services in Moscow, or as they don't call them, the intelligence community there, are probably aware of that and probably have a record of it. How credible is that, John?
The only thing that makes it credible here, I think, is Trump's own public behavior repeatedly for the last year and a half towards Putin and his oft-stated desire to improve relations and be friendly with Putin himself. I mean, no one else here. I know that you like Putin, George, and this isn't about you and me and him. No. This is politically we're talking about. There's no upside in American politics for a Republican nominee, Republican now president-elect, to suck up to a Russian dictator. It's no room for it, and we see.
Well, he won the election, John.
It didn't win the election.
No, he did. He did.
Absolutely, he did. But it
so
wasn't
it didn't harm
because
him.
Of that. It might have harmed him. I mean, I think, first of all, the number one thing that won him the election was this huge desire in America to have a change. And number two, the absolute hatred of Hillary Clinton. And Trump is there running very effectively in his own way. Despite his own mistakes, the wave of change kept pushing him along, and he kept shooting himself in the foot every day. But the wave of change overwhelmed even that, and he ended up winning, and she was almost indicted and all that stuff, and he barely beat her. For him, he runs around now saying, I won a massive victory. He didn't win a massive victory. He won by 80,000 votes out of 130 million votes. 80,000, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan was the difference.
No, you're right. I mean, you'll forgive me pointing out that it was just a little better than George W. Bush, who didn't win at all. But
you don't have to forgive me. I can't stand that guy either. So
no, the purpose of this, it seems to me, and when I look at the coalition that is ranged against him, I can see why that would be. People who are going to lose a lot of money if there are fewer wars in the world, who are going to be out of business if there's less tension and confrontation going on in the world. It seems to me that the only purpose of all this then, if it isn't to stop him taking the oath, has to be to put him in a corner and make it impossible for him to do what he said he would do and build a good relationship with Russia.
Well, that could be. Yeah. I mean, I don't really know where it all comes from. I don't know why. I just know the political impacts of things, and I scratch my head at Trump's behavior about this thing. We've never had a president coming into office outwardly so hostile to the 17 intelligence agencies that will be reporting to him in 1 week. And he has just gone after them daily in his tweeting and in interviews, and they've tried to patch it up. Let me just digress for 1 sec, because I said something before, and I think I'd like your opinion of it. The leak on Tuesday was not about the salacious stuff that's in the dossier. The leak was that, by the way, America, there wasn't this 2-page synopsis of this stuff was given to Trump last Friday. We never knew it till Tuesday afternoon. It was given to Carl Bernstein of Woodward and Bernstein fame, the two journalists who, in effect, brought down Richard Nixon. Bernstein now works part-time for CNN. So it's given to him at CNN Tuesday. It rockets across the news media that afternoon and night. as I said, and became the lead story going into the press conference Wednesday morning. Now, who knew about the two-page synopsis in order to leak it? Had to be someone familiar with what had gone on at these briefings and had to have a motive to want to screw Trump over. Now, James Clapper, the head of national intelligence here, he's a general. He's in charge of the 17 intelligence agencies. He called Trump up Wednesday night after the press conference to tell him, look, we didn't leak it. And he's leaving his job. He's not going to get fired by Trump. He's retiring. So he called him up. He said, we didn't leak that thing. Whoever leaked it on Tuesday didn't come from the intelligence community. George, I think I know who leaked it on Tuesday. I think Barack Obama leaked it. Mm-hmm. I think while he's in Chicago doing his farewell to the presidency speech, he had that thing leaked. And he did it deliberately as a payback for 2011, when he himself is running for re-election and Donald Trump is out running for president himself back then. If you remember, he was looking at running, and he goes to New Hampshire, and it's all over TV, when he announces, I have a team of investigators in Honolulu. We have found unbelievable stuff. Obama was not born in the United States. He's not a legitimate president. He was born in Kenya, and I'm going to prove it. And it was all a fraud, and what we now know is fake news. And I think Trump did it, and he lied all about it. And for 5 years, Obama has been laying in the weeds, waiting to pay him back. And he paid him back Tuesday by leaking out this news about the two-page synopsis, and took a giant monkey wrench and threw it into Donald Trump's presidency.
Well, that sounds entirely plausible to me, and understandable too from a human perspective, and I bow to your greater detailed knowledge of it on that. What happens after a week this evening? What happens when he becomes the president? Do things calm down, or does this febrile, very volatile atmosphere continue?
No one knows, and that's got New York. I'm in New York at the moment. And that has everybody really on the edge of their seats, nervous about what is going to happen. For instance, last Sunday night, they had the Golden Globe Hollywood TV Awards on TV from Los Angeles. A big thing here. It's like the Oscars.
Yes.
Know? And Meryl Streep gets up and, without mentioning Trump's name, criticizes Trump. And he goes crazy and starts tweeting late Sunday night, trashing Meryl Streep, calls her overrated. I mean, this woman's won more awards and been nominated like 50 times for things.
Yep.
And had previously tweeted that she's our best actress. So he did a complete 180 because she attacked him. Now, you asked me what's going to happen in a week when he's president. Well, I don't know. When a president has such a thin skin that he can't take it when an actress criticizes him, what's going to happen when he's president? And people criticize you. You've been elected. I've been elected. The nature of the business is to be criticized 24/7. And you have to learn just to let it go. You just can't let it get under your skin. If he doesn't learn it fast, and he's 70, I don't think he's going to learn it, this thing could erupt into him behaving in a very bizarre manner.
Do you think impeachment of Trump, because I looked at the bookmakers' odds just today, it's 11-10 that Trump will not last the 4 years, that he will be impeached for one piece of misconduct or another. Is there any of that perspective going around in political circles?
After the election, you heard it a little bit for a week or so, and now you don't. Because when you look at it, to impeach a president, it doesn't happen when his own party controls the House and Senate, which the Republicans do. It would be unprecedented for a Republican House to initiate impeachment proceedings against a Republican president. But if he so ticks them off, which he's entirely capable of, and then does something that is clearly a high crime and a misdemeanor, I wouldn't rule it out. He's got a vice president that Republican elected officials feel comfortable with, Mike Pence, because he was one of them. He was in the House. they wouldn't mind having him. But we're a long way from that. But maybe we're not a long way from it. Maybe Trump, he's sitting around talking about $2 billion deals in Dubai. That is an offer of a bribe, was what that was. And he brags about turning it down. But the way he turned it down was as if to say, in the future, if you want to offer me a $2 billion bribe, don't come to me. Go to my 2 sons. That's really what he said. If you go to his sons, you can do it. And that would be considered criminal if he does it.
Now, I well remember the front cover of our satirical magazine, Private Eye. It was a picture of Richard Nixon and Spyro Agnew standing behind him. And the speech bubble said, out of Nixon's mouth, nobody's going to shoot me with this guy next in line. It's a very, very good joke. You say that the House likes Pence, but the rest of us have reason to fear him. He is, as well as being as right-wing as can be, he's a religious fundamentalist, isn't he?
Yep, he is. He's a born-again. By the way, he's a former talk radio host.
My God. There's hope for us yet, John. We
did it in reverse. We got into elected office.
Yeah, but we can always go back. Listen, we'll talk again next week, John, by the grace of God. And stay safe. Don't go on any ice rinks, because we're going to need your wisdom again next Friday, if you'll be with us. Thank you very much indeed, John Le Boutillier, for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. I've got a full switchboard. It's rammed, jammed. So I better get moving. Here's Michael first in northwest London. Go ahead, Michael.
Hi, George. Thanks very much for taking my call.
Pleasure.
I want to talk about Corbyn's appearance on Newsnight earlier this week.
Okay.
It was a very lamentable performance, I must say, and bitterly disappointing for all of those who see themselves as allies of a kind of a socialist agenda. When I think about Corbyn's defense to Laura Kuenssberg's attack, it makes me think that, it was poor for someone who I'm sure has spent the last 45 years trying to construct arguments and being in the public eye and being involved in debates and public speeches and all that kind of stuff, thinking of the arguments that he could make. And he collapsed. He completely collapsed. This is something, talking about the wage cap specifically. This is surely something that he's had a huge amount of time for his ideas.
Or why mention it? He wasn't supposed to mention it. There was no intention to mention it. It seemed to just drop out of his open mouth, apropos nothing at all.
Well, I'll tell you what. If that came out of Bernie Sanders' mouth approximately 12 months ago, I promise you, Bernie Sanders would not have been trampled over like Jeremy Corbyn was. And if I can move on a little bit to your conversation with Aaron Bastani.
Just before you do, Michael, let me respond on some. I didn't see the interview. I couldn't bear, wild horses couldn't drag me to watch Newsnight any longer. But it has to be said that Laura Kuenssberg and the BBC are in full jihad mode against the Labour Party and against Jeremy Corbyn. That doesn't obviate the point that you make or negate the point that you make. Jeremy Corbyn should be much, much, much better at handling these people than he is. But even if he had been terrific, you could be sure that Laura would have dusted herself down and continued the jihad the very next day. Sorry, go on.
Well, there was another gentleman some decades ago who was a senior member of the Labour Party who was exposed to the same level of abuse, virile abuse from the BBC, Tony Benn, who conducted himself with a little bit more kind of decorum and charm and power of argument. I know...
He's not Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn is no Tony Benn, but then nobody is another Tony Benn. Anyway, move on to your Aaron Bastani point, please.
I must admit, I was quite struck by the change of tone in your approaching Jeremy Corbyn, because for all of those, many of us that tune in every single week, you have been one of the, if not the foremost defender, with the possible exception of Aaron Bastani himself in the media. And it almost seemed like you were taking these, so I need to be careful with my words here, but you were posing the challenges to Jeremy Corbyn that Aaron Bastani was to answer. I just wondered whether you could sort of explain where you're at with Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, partly it's because my job. It's my job to interview people, and an interview doesn't consist of two people agreeing with each other. So it's part of my job to be a devil's advocate, and perhaps I should do it more often. The things that he was saying about Jeremy Corbyn, I profoundly disagree with. I agree far more with Robert in London in his call earlier, that actually, when the history of this period comes to be written, Jeremy Corbyn's failure to remain principled on the issue of the European Union, and at the very least, after the people had voted for Brexit, his failure to pick it up and run with it and reap the political rewards for so doing may come to be seen as his final failure. Now, I still am a defender of Jeremy Corbyn, but I'm getting fed up. I'm getting frustrated by a number of things, and one of them is the thing that you just said, that he really needs to be much better. He needs a level of energy and vibrancy in taking his case to the people that I'm just not feeling it, Michael.
Yeah, I think that view is felt. And you know what? Mark from Liverpool needs a shout out. I wish almost, a small part of me wishes Jeremy Corbyn was in a leadership election. Maybe he'd call up every week again. But I think his kind of perspective sums it up a little bit. You've got a working class guy from Liverpool. You know, he is left-wing. Even though he seems kind of anti-Corbyn, the guy's left-wing. And he's saying that Corbyn's not the one. And that is quite worrying, isn't it? Because surely, you know, if you're a left-wing guy and you've got a left-wing leader of the Labour Party, that's just a banked vote. But with Jeremy Corbyn, it's kind of not actually a banked vote. And that is kind of a worry. If I can just move on to one final point, George. Earlier on RT, on Russia Today, you appeared because they were talking about this kind of spectre of Russian hacking.
Yes.
And they you know, apparently C-SPAN was taken over by Russia Today or something. You know, it's unbelievable weirdness going on. But interestingly, you said that RT was the only journalistic outfit that wasn't fake news. I just wonder whether you could, you know, explain that a little bit.
Well, for fullness, you should say that I told everyone to question more, including questioning RT more. If you saw the interview, you'll know that I said that. And you'll know that I said, whatever it is you're watching, watch a little less of it and try something else instead. Whatever it is you're reading, read a little less of it and read something else instead. The only way to get a balanced perspective and some approximation of the truth is to hop across all the news channels, all the sources of news. But I am absolutely certain that RT is closer to the truth than CNN or Fox News or any of these other so-called mainstream outfits. Of course, it all depends on your perspective, your point of view. But their take on the events is far closer to what I think is the truth. But in any case, I'm not saying you should only watch RT. Heaven forfend, that would be ridiculous.
Sure. I think that's my contribution done. Thank you very much, George.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And speak of the devil, here he comes. Mark from Liverpool. Go ahead, Mark.
Hello, George. You okay, mate?
I'm okay. Did you hear that paean of praise to you from the previous caller?
Yeah, I know, and I don't really get much praise often nowadays, so thank you for that there, lad.
Okay.
Hey, listen, I've got something to tell you.
Tell me.
Listening to Nigel Farage started the show in Bandit Country, yeah, and he started using the thing, it's key for the show, which come and have a go if you think you're hard enough.
Oh, so anyway, how derivative is that? Nigel Farage stealing my jingle.
It's shocking, and there was a Guardian journalist sat there, right? He said, see, this is how savvy he is and how great it is. So we got straight on the dog, mate. I got straight on the dog and said, listen, he stole it off George Galloway. think of it, Nigel Farage using George's show. Anyway, he took it down.
Oh, very good, very good.
Yeah, anyway.
I'll tell you what, though, Mark, just before you move on, you'll notice they haven't scheduled Farage up against me. They haven't put Farage on the radio at the same time as me. And I'll tell you for why. Because we'd beat him out the park. Because this is the university of the airwaves. And it's thanks to people like you, who, whatever we disagree on, Mark, you always argue your corner very well. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, George. Yeah, we're operating on different levels, aren't we? Let's have it right. Anyway, so listen, I'm really just one of the things that come out of this Brexit light, and I don't feel comfy saying this, but I will do, right, is how vacuous, how shallow, how petty, how selfish our nation's becoming, bit by bit, slowly. And this is what concerns me about the talk from the Labour Party and from the left. There was no good news about Sister Munt leaving today. It was bad news all round. It's all right for me and you, and especially you, who's a lot more clued up than I am, to go onto the reasons, and he thought this, he thought that. We've got to start thinking now how we're going to get shut of a Tory government. And we need to appeal to all people. And how that come across today on different news networks and that was that another Labour MP left the party. It's bad news all around me. Now, the people of Stoke, I hope you get yourselves together, get united and get out there on them streets. Now, it's up to you if you want to sit in your house and be an armchair MP or armchair Prime Minister, like the football managers in their armchairs. You've got to get out and push your MP to stand up for your rights and what's important to you in your area. And that's the main thing. I've heard the electorate will look at people like Sister Munt and think, well, at least we've got people like that in the party to temper the way more extreme excesses of the far left. It's got to be a broad church, George, or we'll never get shut of the Tory people.
Well, I agree with that. I've been in the Labour Party. I should correct myself. I was in the Labour Party under Harold Wilson, James Callaghan, Michael Foot, Neil Kinnock, John Smith, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown. No, I wasn't. I was expelled before Gordon Brown came along. And I've always felt that the Labour Party has to be a coalition of socialists and social democrats. Someone like John McTernan, for example, who's on a personal level a friend of mine, he needs to be in the Labour Party, and so does somebody like me have to be in the Labour Party. You need a coalition of the working class movement and their allies, their intellectual allies, their middle class allies, and so on. That's the way you build a coalition that Mr. Wilson won 4 general elections with, Mr. Attlee won a landslide with in 1945, and all of them changed the country for the better. But the advent of Blairism was a period in which people like me were expelled out of the Labour Party, even though we've now turned out to be entirely correct in what we said about the war in Iraq. We were expelled and never allowed back in again, never a possibility of coming back in again, and I personally no longer want to come back in again. So it's the right of the party that broke that compact, if you like, Mark, this coalition of the socialists and the social democrats.
Well, George, listen, I've got no real arguments, have I? Your commitment's been undeniable, and I hope you go against what you think about not wanting to join, because we need you back. I've just talked about the further to the right in our party. We need people like you. It's imperative we have people like you if we want to move forward. And I want to thank you for all your good work.
Thank you, Mark.
You've mean a lot in our house for a many long year now, and my dad loved you.
Many thanks, Mark. God bless you. I appreciate that. Stuart sends an email. I agree with you, George. I worry for Trump's safety. JFK is proof that when the dark forces want rid of you, you're dust. Then some lone gunman will be set up as a scapegoat. Then he ends up as dust. Stuart from London. Now my switchboard is jammed, so I need to rattle on and I'll have to speak less. Rhys is in South Wales. Let's hear from him.
Hi, George. Thanks for taking my call.
Welcome, Rhys. Go ahead.
Okay, so I just want to get onto the topic of Jeremy Corbyn. It's increasingly frustrating. I thought I was the only one, but it looks as though I'm not.
You're
judging
not.
by the couple of calls this evening.
You're not.
So as soon as he gets into an interview, the narrative and the language that he uses is so unappealing to the people he should be appealing to. You can almost hear him screaming at the TV. One of his favourite phrases is "stop exploitation of migrant workers," and you can hear people shouting, "What about the workers in the country already, and what about their rights, etc., etc." Then the wage cap, which I haven't heard your opinion on it, but my opinion is that he should never have opened his mouth. The best method to cap somebody's wages through taxation, because that creates a revenue.
Well, there's just no doubt about that. I support as you've heard me say, I think here before, the Aristotle line that in society, I'm talking a long way down the road, the richest person should not be more than 3 times richer than the poorest person in the society. That was Aristotle's line. It's also mine. And that's a better line than Jeremy Corbyn's. But the way to achieve that is clearly and obviously to tax the income and the wealth in a progressive way of the richest people, so you can distribute the wealth that you are taxing them on. A policy which means the entire Arsenal football club has to get on a plane and go and play in China or somewhere else is clearly a bonkers policy.
Yeah, but the language he uses is bonkers as well. I know he says that immigration is not too high for the country. It's just his approach to everything. We all know immigration has an effect on the economy, and a positive one in some effects as well. And it also has an effect on our NHS. He just needs to go around it the right way. If we need 20,000 doctors to support the NHS, then I'm going to advertise for them if we can't train them here quick enough. If we need 50,000 skilled workers, then I'm going to advertise for them because our economy needs to grow. Those are numbers. He doesn't have to put a cap on it.
Exactly.
He just has to put some substance and some balance into the argument.
Well, I hope he's listening. I hope he's listening, Rhys, because you're bang on the money on that. But Aaron Bastani revealed a lot tonight in the interview that we had. Corbyn cannot do that because the activist base, according to Aaron, simply won't wear that. And he has to choose between what the voters want and what the activists want. And that's a very dangerous place to be in. Thanks for the call. John's in Glasgow. Go ahead, John.
Good evening, George.
Hi.
2 things, Tristram Hunt and Donald Trump, if I may.
Yes.
Tristram Hunt, one of your previous callers was very eloquent about the situation. I think you've been very generous with Tristram Hunt in giving him the motivation of Iraq leaving the sinking ship and traitorous. I think it's more fundamental than that, which is that basically he stands for nothing. And it's the dreadful careerist group of people which pervades many sections in the Parliament at the moment.
I do think, though, it's an act of sabotage, a deliberate, contrived act of sabotage, because he thinks that Labour will lose that by-election. And do you know what, John? He might be right.
He may well be, but I think if these MPs want to ditch out, they should be like soldiers. If you signed up, if you want out, you got to buy yourself out. He's not the only one. Louise Mensch, Jamie Reid, even David Cameron, Prime Ministers, Blair. The time to look for a new job is at the end of the term. If you want to do the crime, you should do the time. Yeah,
it's an affront to the Parliament, and even worse, it's an affront to the people you asked to vote for you just 2 years ago.
Exactly.
And you've ratted on them for a better job, for more money.
Correct, and the party and the activists who helped you get there.
Exactly so. John, thanks for the call. Oh, yes, Donald Trump. Tell me.
Well, Donald Trump, he has no objection in doing exactly the same as you do, which is occasionally telling the reporter to get lost.
Well, I think he's on to something on that.
And the public.
Yeah, you see, what he's really saying in the press conference to the media was, I don't need you. I didn't get here through any help that you gave me. And I don't need you in order to stay here. I'm going over you, under you, around you, through you. And the more I confront you, the better it gets for me. And up to a point, he's right about that. John, thanks. I must press on because Laura is in London and wants to talk. Go ahead, Laura.
Yeah, hi, good evening, George. Can I just quickly say that Trump is no angel, but I did like the fact that he spoke so directly and bluntly to BuzzFeed, CNN, and even referred to BBC as another beauty, sarcastically.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. apparently was invited by Trump to meet with him very recently to set up a committee about vaccines. And it's got the scientists and Big Pharma got their knickers in a twist. So if the politicians don't do Trump in and wipe him out, I think Big Pharma certainly will, because...
Laura, Trump launched a vitriolic attack against the pharmaceutical industry for their super exploitation of sick people who need their product. Hillary Clinton would never have done that. Trump, the right-wing Republican, is the one who launched a bitter attack on the exploitative nature of the drugs industry.
Yeah, and with regard vaccines, he said, why is it that there are beautiful babies and they're given a ton load of several different vaccines on the same day in the same vaccine, and then they come home feverish and later on, come down with autism. And he said, we've got to find out, is there a link, isn't there a link, or that, why do the vaccines have to all be given on the same day at the same time, So for him to get the nephew of the assassinated Kennedys involved, and Robert Kennedy, is pro-environment, and he's talked about the Native Americans at DAPL. He's gone there to support them and visit them. He's anti the poisoning of water in Flint, Michigan, and other places. So
he sounds like a very fine man, like his father. God rest his soul, definitely was. Laura, thanks for that call. Simon is also in London. Let's hear from Simon. Go ahead.
Hello there. I wanted to speak in relation to our dear friend Mr. Trump. It appears that his foreign policy is being crafted by none other than Henry Kissinger, the warmonger in chief.
Well, he was Clinton's foreign policy advisor.
Yep, he's seen something in Trump which he likes. He stated on record that with Trump they have an amazing opportunity which they haven't had in a very long time. And it appears that the game plan is to befriend Russia in order to weaken the global South alliance of Russia, China, and Iran, to antagonize Iran, declare war on them by giving full backing.
Listen, Simon, this is a very, very bad line, but let me respond to the point that you make. First of all, Kissinger was Hillary Clinton's foreign policy advisor. If he's now seeking to advise Trump, then that just shows how promiscuous the old fellow is. Secondly, the putative defense secretary, Mad Dog Mateless, this day, declared that notwithstanding everything Trump had said about the Iran nuclear deal, that the United States would have to stick to it. He said, laughably, when the United States gives her word, we have to keep it. So Trump has already dropped the plan to reverse the Iran peace deal. And he does have a beef with China. America has a beef with China. It has some justification for that beef in terms of currency speculation and so on. But if he's trying to divide Russia from China, he'll definitely fail in that regard. Ron is in London. I don't know if this will be the last call. I've got so many. One more, I think. Ron, welcome to the show.
Oh, hi there, George. Thanks for having me.
Welcome.
It's not Ron, by the way. It's Lon, as in way. But just a quick point, George. I've been following you for a while, and I've got to be honest, I'm finding it kind of hard to recognise that you're taking on Trump, because ultimately, I was watching a video of you yesterday where you speculated that it might actually be a good thing if he comes through on his promises. But you actually said this on the same day that there was quite a historic Senate committee meeting where one of Trump's nominees for Attorney General one of his own members is actually testifying against him. So, I mean, there are, in short, George, I have to ask you this.
Mm-hmm.
What would you say? I appreciate you support Trump, and I know why.
I don't support him, but go on.
Yeah, I appreciate why you say that you're very happy that Hillary is is not, and also happy that Trump is.
Yeah.
But ultimately, for me personally, I supported Trump until he won. The moment he won, I started to campaign against him.
Mm-hmm.
Because, George, I've been following you for years. What will you say to the black Americans, the people of color in America, that have woken up to this administration? What will you say to the Palestinians even that are looking at this as a Zionist-filled administration? That's
but they're all here's what I'll say, Ron. In 6 days' time, the first black president of the United States will step down, and that black president has presided over the gunning down in the streets of black people in America in unprecedented numbers. So all American administrations preside over racial injustice, division, disadvantage, and police brutality, racism and bigotry, even the black ones. Second,
how many though?
What?
Sorry.
Second, all American presidents give billions of pounds to the settler state of Israel, irrespective of whether they are illegally settling Palestinian land or not. They gave them scores of billions of money and materiel and weapons so to do. Barack Obama, with whom I have spoken personally about Palestine and who knows everything about Palestine, gave Israel more money than any American president in history and gave them $38 billion just a few weeks ago. So what I will say to Palestinians, if you don't mind me saying so, leave my relations with the Palestinians to me. I've got quite good standing there in that regard. What I would say to them is that every American president is on his knees or her knees. Clinton would have done more, would have gone further down that line. And so on race, on Palestine, I'm completely against the policy of Donald Trump. On the nominee for Attorney General, I think the nominee is a complete monstrosity. And a monstrosity right out of Mississippi burning. But that doesn't change my analysis that actually it would have been far worse for America and more importantly for the rest of the world if Hillary Clinton had been president instead. Sorry I can't let you back in, Ron, because it's 9:55 and 29 seconds. Just time to talk to Robert, waiting patiently in Australia.
Hello, George.
Hi, Robert. Go ahead.
I've just started listening to you on the internet because I've started following you on Twitter. I just want to say one thing that left-leaning people may not be aware about Donald Trump. He campaigned in the election for the financial reform called Glass-Steagall, where you separate high street banks or commercial banks from Wall Street and London investment banks.
Yeah.
Bernie Sanders set the tone in the campaign on the Democratic side.
Yep.
Hillary opposed it all the way, but Trump picked it up, and he also campaigned for it. So there's there's a movement started in America among Bernie Sanders supporters that's now going international to send a message to Trump to deliver on that promise. He was either leading the public along, or he's one of these. There are a whole bunch of conservatives who actually accept that a lot of the deregulation of Wall Street proved to be a disaster when 2008 happened. Even people like Nigel Lawson in the UK want Glass-Steagall back. So this is something that we can achieve. If Glass-Steagall is enacted in the United States, the UK will probably soon have to follow suit. Countries like Australia will have to follow suit. And what it does, it puts Wall Street and the City of London banks on a leash. Right? They don't have the ability to prey on the finances of ordinary people anymore to fund their gambling and all that kind of stuff. So if people want to know more
I'll tell you, go on, tell me, quickly.
just Google Ohio Revolution. That's where this Bernie Sanders group is.
Okay.
And they have a statement there that anyone in the world can endorse.
And let me tell you, Robert, exactly the same point is made in an interview aired on RT with me tomorrow by none other than Aaron Banks. Watch out for it. You'll be surprised. It's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you.